That's
To let you
great.
know, I actually know who you are before your book came out, obviously because you're in the food space, but also because I wrote a piece a couple of years ago on JBS and I used your Forbes articles as material. Yeah.
Oh, cool. Amazing. Well, happy to get into the JVS saga now, later, whenever. It's, oh my God, it continues to twist, turn,
Yeah. Well, because they are
fascinating.
technically the largest in the world, right?
Yeah, largest in the world. And in the US, JBS has the pretty much top to second position in every sector: chicken, beef, pork, at least.
Wow. Yeah, there's so much I want to ask you about. We will keep it relatively brief. Um, why don't we start and we just let people join and, we will post this so it'll be available for people moving forward. Great. So thank you to
Awesome.
everybody who's joined so far. So excited to have you, Chloe, for a new project we're piloting called CFS Book Club, where we highlight authors who are writing books and creating materials that are relevant and educational and important and informative when it comes to food issues that affect all of us. So you wrote a book that came out in December called Raw Deal: Hidden Corruption, Corporate Greed, and the Fight of Meat. Yes, thank you for featuring. And congratulations. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank
And
you so much for
so
having
why don't
me.
we just start with what got you interested in meat and corporations and corporate consolidation in the first place? I know you're a journalist for Forbes, but what personally informed your investment in this topic?
Yeah, so I started out at Forbes on the billionaires desk, the wealth team, we called it essentially. And I was doing the valuations, all the kind of back end investigating for the net worth numbers that you see on a lot of the signature Forbes lists. So Forbes 400, World Billions, and I was through that, from looking at the balance sheets and personal asset statements of hedge funders and real estate billionaires and folks from across the spectrum of business, that I really realized that in food, there particularly was so much consolidation. That's how you pretty much were able to become a food billionaire. You had to have a lot of corporate control, a lot of essentially equity amassed and hoarded over the years. And so Tyson, the Cargill family, lots of different chicken processors and beef processors I was looking at. And then, flash forward 7, 8 years later, when the pandemic hit, it was those same billionaires that were, then telling me, when it's raining gold outside, we're walking around with buckets. And, this was at the same time as all these different crazy price fixing lawsuits and climate reports coming out and recalls happening. And the consolidation question just really, continued to not really be addressed. But at the same time, we also had workers really struggling, or I interviewed so many different workers in 2020 around, being scared to show up on the line, or, having their company that has so much corporate control still not giving, them any chicken for their freezers, having their freezers be empty. And so the kind of corporate control and consolidation, I started to realize really went hand in hand with, environmental degradation, public health issues, worker discrimination, and also just this mass inequity that's
Yeah.
in our food system.
Yeah, I remember reading about everything that was happening with Tyson and the workers and during COVID. So overwhelmingly sad. Um, so why don't you?
Yeah, and at the hands of those meat packers too, right? Like those CEOs, those executives were working hand in hand with state, local, federal governments. Some of them were even like actually writing some of the executive order drafts. I mean, there's some crazy FOIAs and reports
Wow,
that
I
have come
didn't
out
know
since.
that they were involved. Wow. Okay.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah, like that executive order, that Trump executive order that kept the meat packing plants open, that I think was such a kind of crystallizing point in so many shoppers' minds. Yeah, that was there's been massive reports of how many different hands and lobbyists and different even CEOs read that before, but Tyson, Smithfield, those companies were very involved in dictating policy and how it would help
So
them.
within your position, how did you find out that information?
Investigating, it takes A lot. um, and it's interesting because I was really trying to also focus on the kind of amassing of profits and how that can create long-term wealth. But then it's really hard to change, right? That status quo is then you know, dictated by that billionaire owner or, that handful of small directors and group and owners that can control these companies. And that's how we have a lot of stalemate, right, around environment and health and just what's even in these products to begin with. So, it took a lot, definitely a lot of signal and off the record talking to employees, but also FOIAs. And, the government has tried to hold some corporations and statesmen accountable through different, FOIA requests that then have been made public or, other different like landmark, really big reports and hearings that have happened.
Just really quick, can you break down for me what is a FOIA? I know what it is, but for our listeners, because FOIAs are so critical in investigative journalism, aren't they?
Absolutely. Yeah, so the Freedom of Information Act is a friend of journalists all over this country because it really helps you get, access to documents. If essentially if any public official, through an email or through a official phone, sends a communication, for example, that is something that is able to be FOIA'd, and that's how, it was able to be found out that meatpackers were really dictating specific words and really the goals of these policies.
Wow, we use FOIAs a lot in our lawsuits as well, so they're very important. Very important public good, I suppose. Yeah.
Public,
So why
well,
don't you
yeah.
tell us about your book?
Yeah, so Raw Deal, it's called Raw Deal, Hidden Corruption, Corporate Greed, and the Fight for the Future of Meat. And it kind of takes you through this story and this how we got to where we are today, which is this really broken, messed up food system. It takes you the story of the corporate consolidation and how there's a small handful of billionaires who have amassed pretty much almost all the wealth and power that dictates the vast majority of how we get all the meat in this country and all of it that goes around the world. And, then goes into this crazy saga of JBS, the world's largest meat packer, which we were talking about a little bit earlier, and how these billionaires from Brazil use illicit funds and ill-gotten gains and just different preferential access to loans to essentially take over America's meat market, and how those ramifications still impact public policy today. I mean, Elizabeth Warren just sent a letter out a few days ago around how JBS is still able to be a contractor for the U.S. public school lunch program. But, the USDA continues to pick them because they need access to cheap meat, they say. And JBS is a crucial element of that. This corporate consolidation, they say, is, a big part of how we can get so much meat so prevalent and so cheaply. But really, it isn't so cheap because there's not this true cost accounting for all the different ramifications that still end up on taxpayers' bills at the end of the day, right? From health, again, this environmental bill that continues to come up and will continue to be a significant issue for generations and generations to come. I mean, there's already been irreversible damage. And so the book then goes into, these climate questions and the, biogas, and industrial hog farms, and is that a real climate solution? It goes into, the alternatives that are being touted in this like frenzy from investors to profit off of the future of food, even if it really doesn't end up ensuring that we're going to get a healthier, nutritious, or environmentally sustainable product. Also, tells the story of bison in this country and how there are some folks trying to rematriate and really bring that more back to the forefront, using, techniques that have just been horribly, pushed out as industrialization and colonization and corporatization has really, sucked up its place. And it's that kind of vacuum, power vacuum. And so then it also, at the end of the day, talks about how to feed a better future. And, why do we have public access to healthcare, or public access to, water even, but not public access to food. It talks about, how could we really put a public food sector into place? When does universal food access really how can it really get there? It also talks about like infrastructure and how we need to regionalize this food system so we all have the ability to really withstand crisis and dignity.
Yeah. Wow, it sounds very comprehensive. What?
Lots of different points, but I really wanted to write this book because I sit at this nexus of like wealth and power and the billionaire food world, but at the same time, there's so much else going on, and I just never saw these gaps being bridged, and I think that's like what's really holding back a lot of the stalemate and a lot of this status quo
Yeah.
from changing.
Yeah. Well, in that vein, I'm wondering if you can break down as best you can sort of how JBS came to be the largest protein company in the world and why they have such a.
Yeah, the story of JBS is truly something. It's one of the other kind of major reasons I really wanted to write this book because, folks are buying JBS meat every day. Americans have no idea where their meat is coming from. That's helping to keep, companies and the billionaires behind JBS continue to be in power. But so it goes back around a little over a decade. Even their first acquisition in the US was in 2007, but it all was essentially funded, a lot of it anyway, a huge amount was funded from preferential access to different loan officers and different politicians and policymakers in Brazil who they had on their payroll for different kickbacks and bribes for years and years. They ended up getting charged in Brazil with a bunch of different things, including, some 36 counts of different bribery. And, in the US, there were also violations with the SEC, and their parent company ended up, getting investigated in a settlement with the DOJ. And I can go into all the details of how these bribes were exchanged. It's this crazy story, but at the end of the day, this company is now, even with all this scrutiny, has still continued to maintain a massive place in the American market. They are the number 2 in chicken, beef, pork. They've pretty much taken over huge amounts of American infrastructure. Lots of iconic companies that have been around for decades, consolidated them, and now they're a force to be reckoned with, and something that's extremely hard to unwind. It's something extremely hard for, there's a saying, I enjoy quoting my book, it's the eggs that are scrambled. It's really hard to unscramble them. And the U.S. government's become, reliant on cheap meat from JBS because, they're one of the major players in almost every market. And there are some markets that are so uncompetitive that there are only 1 or 2 players buying some of this meat, or, giving it to grape growers contracts. We can go back because essentially there's 2 brothers. They took over their father's very small butcher, and they had these global ambitions. They wanted to take their small family company and bring it around the world. And it was part of that ego, part of that drive that had this kickback scheme started. And essentially there were just a series of different deals, and they purchased first Swift, which was really a challenge company. They later then, purchased up a huge majority of Pilgrim's Pride, and the bribe for that deal alone was a $55 million kickback that went into the account of the Brazilian loan officer. And that was, in a US bank account. There are lots of different ways that this bribery scheme really did take place on US soil. Another transfer was a $1.5 million Manhattan apartment as a kickback. There are several different US banks that are involved and still haven't really, been acknowledged for continue to hold these accounts for these companies and these billionaires, the holding companies. But there were 3 different instances even where Brazilian presidents were involved in these bribes. And Joesley Batista himself was even, in his testimony talking about that, thousands and thousands of pages of documents that I was going through, different lawsuits I had to do to read all this. And Joesley Batista, at one point disclosed that, he had to hand a bag of cash to Lula, who is formerly the president, now the president. At that point was in his a few years of off period while Dilma was the president, but was still running the show and running the Workers' Party and kind of behind a lot of these kickbacks, because at the end of the day, they weren't just kind of one-off kickbacks here or there. There's one loan officer that eventually, said, okay, hey, now I need to use these kickbacks and you're going to help me dole out these funds. And we're going to try and essentially buy our way into securing the presidential seat for this next Brazilian presidential election. So it ended up, completely blowing back in their faces. There's just all these crazy little details, and oh my gosh, lots of coins falling and being exchanged. But it's this mind-blowing story. And in the U.S., I mean, regulators have acknowledged that foreign corruption has been taking place, and yet they're still chugging along. The status quo continues, and JBS continues to make money off of
Yeah.
feedlots and factory farming in America.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm thinking about how it sounds like in Brazil, JBS had a lot of power regardless of administration. And it feels like it's very similar in the US, is it not?
Yeah, they're ingratiated. They're very good at getting their company, to fill this need and voids, and then become quite
Wow.
intractable.
Well, so what has your experience been like reporting on such a large company and the other corporations? I mean, there aren't that many, and they're all very powerful in the meat industry.
Yeah, no, they are. And I'm sure I'm on, some list somewhere, whatever. But, I mean, I'm a journalist, right? I did very serious fact checking for this book with the whole team of folks that I hired, and we were, working all day and night to make sure what we were putting out was, what it needed to be. And there was dialogue with every company that was in the book, and with JBS, that's no different. I would love to be able to interview the Batista brothers, but unfortunately, that's never been made available to me. But I continue to try. I'm a journalist who, I try for years and years to get different entrepreneurs or folks to talk to me, and every once in a while, a few years in, it actually ends up working out. So I will continue to try, because I think there's still a lot more to the story. I'd even mentioned that both brothers, they went to jail for 6 months, and they still don't continue to be on the board and have ownership, and kind of run the stakes.
Wow.
And they're not going away anytime soon. They're quite young, so it's
Well,
it's a lot. It's a
so
lot.
tell me, in your book, you talk about climate change, and it is such a controversial piece of the climate puzzle. And I'm curious if there's anything that you discovered through your research and through discovering different potential movements and solutions. What do you think would be surprising for people to know about the role of animals in climate change?
Yeah, I mean, I think the overall thesis, I want to be clear about this, because, I mean, while the book is a bit, uh, critical of alternative meats, especially because of this investor frenzy to profit off of the future of food, which is having us create this insecure future here. You know, well, overall meat consumption, industrial meat production needs to stop. Well, factory farming needs to stop. Well, overuse of antibiotics needs to come to an end. CAFOs need to stop. There is a place for animal agriculture. There is a place for meat in the future, especially when you consider, how there just are some lands that are maybe either degraded via, industrial chemical crops over generations and generations and monoculture, or, just different types of landscapes that, maybe they're too rocky, and only animals will be able to, produce meat on, or food off of that land, off of that soil. And rewilding is a whole separate conversation, but there are significant needs for soils to be regenerated truly only through manure and hooves, and that there's some lands that will not be able to regenerate otherwise, and so that's seriously important. um, that said, meat consumption does need to go down, and there is a place for alternatives and mushrooms, beans, legumes, but also mycelium to potentially help even out this burden, because there's a serious burden that the food industry and its industrialization and consolidation has placed on everyday
Mhm.
humanity, and it's not okay. And at the end of the day, my book really talks about how to re-regionalize the food system, and how we need to be able to better support these like community organizations and small farms, local farms, and not just talking about the past decade of disappointment with that, right? Because there's been like a decade of talking about
Mhm.
farmers markets, yay, but still such a tiny percentage of like overall volume that we need something with scale still. So I talk a lot about CSAs and how you can use partner networks or food hubs to kind of overlay on that and really to help, leverage the burden of these logistics with all the producers involved. Well, there's still a lot of stuff and we could use. But in terms of climate, I will say, I hope the book and I hope people who are reading the book are excited that it really takes the approach of not just being about emissions and carbon offsets and credits and just the carbon aspect of it. It really talks about soil monoculture, water pollution, air pollution. Just there's so much more involved in this environmental desecration than corporations really want us to believe. And by design, it is, hidden for that reason. But I do think it's like a more, situation that'll help us all to make better decisions.
Yeah. And in that vein, one thing I want to ask you about really quickly is the Farm Bill, because I know that they allocated $19.5 billion for conservation programs, one of them being EQIP, what's it stand for? Environmental Quality Incentives Program, and it's almost like half of it. And I learned recently that right now, under law, not the IRA, but under the Farm Bill law, 50% of that funding has to go towards livestock. And so it, enables the continuation of CAFOs, even if they're environmentally friendly methods. And so I'm curious for you, like, how do you think about the Farm Bill that is forming, and what needs to change, what could change in an ideal world?
I think this Farm Bill is so important because, right, it funds for 5 years, and we really only have 7 years left to make this major overhaul type change that we really need to see happen. That said, I don't have the most hope in this political system and making the actual structural, real meaningful change that we need to see to actually, get things like that in place. That there are, it's that, but it's also that by 1,000 cuts. So many other examples of that. There are decades and billions of dollars have been spent on the meat industry being able to insulate itself from current or also future regulation or future pressure to change how they do what they want to do. And the Farm Bill, I think, is a huge example of something where we really need to put everything there is possible towards really making meaningful change. But SNAP alone makes this super difficult. I was speaking, I did an event with Marion Nessel a month ago, and I was trying to be really optimistic about the Farm Bill. She was little less optimistic than me, and I completely understand why. But I think we have to be, because this is one of the pretty much only opportunities we have left, and it's no joke.
Yeah, it's
terrifying.
No joke. Before I let you go, is there anything else you want to say about the book, and anything in your discovery in writing the book that also fascinated you or totally surprised you?
Yeah, I'll end on a little antibiotic stuff, because this is the Center for Food Safety and all, but it's also about workers. And so, I think we all have seen antibiotic-free meat in the markets for years. There's now a lot of class action lawsuits in different cases of, maybe that meat that was sold as antibiotic-free for more money really wasn't raised without antibiotics, which is a problem. But what I didn't realize, and what I thought was horribly mind-blowing through this reporting, was when I realized that antibiotics that are used, and when there's overuse of antibiotics, and there will be more cases of antibiotic resistance occurring as climate change gets worse, because that's just what happens when the earth gets hotter. But workers really have no idea the hidden costs of what they do, what they're really signing up for when they're starting any meatpacking job. And that's on so many different types of health risks and safety concerns, but it's also around antibiotic resistance, because a superbug can actually colonize a body in a day, an hour, a shift. So meatpacking industry, targets pretty much some of the most, vulnerable workers in our country. And many of them are refugees. Many of them are speaking, dozens of different languages, many immigrants, many women, many people of color. And they may not even know they're even setting up for a transitory period in their life or a summer, for example, or a season that, they could contract a superbug and it could be in their bodies and it might not activate then. It might not ever activate, but it also might activate, in a few decades when maybe they're sick with a pneumonia or something else. And all of a sudden that disease can quickly become something completely different. And it's a silent killer that is one of the other ways that these meatpacking workers are not being tracked and taken care of. And really the full breadth of how much burden they're bearing isn't really understood
Wow.
or acknowledged.
Yeah. So nuanced, so layered, very upsetting, but so important that people know and learn about this. So thank you so much for your work and for sharing your book. And I hope more people read it and learn because it's extremely valuable.
Thank you so much. And it doesn't have to be all dark and negative. I do think there are really big moments for opportunity and optimism, universal food, infrastructure,
Yeah.
and, this farm bill.
Awesome. Thank you
Thank you
so
for having me.
much. Have a great rest of your day. Bye.
You too.
If I can figure out how to say this.